Hi all and welcome to this year's Azure Back to School. I will tell you what the world would look like if Azure Arc didn't exist. So my name is Karel De Winter. I'm a cloud solution architect working at Dexmark. It's a Belgian company. And also I'm a member of the Tech9 user group. So it's a user group that mainly focuses on IT pro stuff, but Azure stuff as well. I'm a Microsoft certified trainer and also an Azure MVP. And if you want to reach out to me, please do so on Twitter or connect on LinkedIn. And if you want to read my blog, the site name is below. So a long time ago, I was a system engineer and infrastructure engineer, and I still remember the times when entering a data center, when entering the room, you see all the blinking lights and you have to change some switches or install some hardware, do some maintenance on a storage device. Those were the good old times. And even now, we see that the customer environments are still using hybrid and it's still very complex scenarios. So they have an on-premises situation, they have an on-premises data center, but they also have right now a cloud environment, can even be a multi-cloud environment. And their applications are growing. So they not only have applications that are sitting on premises, but they're also building new applications in the cloud. They are having cloud native applications within their multi-cloud strategy. And we also see that they have a diverse infrastructure. So they have different hardware spread over different data centers spread over the world, but they need to manage those infrastructure and also manage that in one uniform way. What we also see is that the environment, but also the applications are evolving. So that means that we are going from not only a small amount of applications, but the applications are growing. It's on a diverse infrastructure, so multiple data centers, multiple hosters, branch offices, even on IoT devices in the edge. The applications are hosted on VMs, but also hosted in containerized. So we are looking right now in containerized applications. And like I said, multi-cloud environments are very common these days and mainly in big enterprises. So the customer pains that we see right now, the things that the customers really need a solution for is how we are going to use the Azure tags that we know and use right now in an Azure environment. How are we going to use that in an on-premises environment? How are we going to do the same things like management things in an on-premises environment that we now do in our cloud environment? Those are all the pains that coming up right now for different customers. How are we going to use the same policies, the same compliancy that we have in our Azure environment that, for example, Azure policy is giving us? And how are we going to put that in our on-premises data center? How can we have one single pane of glass to see our compliance status, but also to see if things are running well, if things are updated, and so on. So those are mainly the customer pains that we know right now. The customers want to extend the cloud capabilities, but stay in their own data center, mainly for things like data sovereignty and compliancy things. So the benefits of going hybrid, the benefits and also the reasons to have a hybrid but also a multi-cloud strategy is to have your data in your own on-premises data centers, in your own environment, in your own country. If a company wants to have its data in its own country, then the only option is that you can host it on your own data center. And for that, hybrid is going to stay. It's not going away. The things are right now that a lot of enterprises are still having a lot of data centers because the data needs to be as close as to the company as possible. The other thing that we see is that application and also data modernization is happening. So companies want to leverage those capabilities that they have in the cloud. So they want to modernize the applications, but they are still stuck on their on-premises data centers, on their on-premises environments, what are mainly VMs or containerized applications. But what if they want to leverage the cloud capabilities, for example, scaling and high availability and so on? How can they do that in an on-premises data center? And that's where Azure Arc will come in, not only for application modernization, but also for business continuity. So how are they going to do DR strategies? How are they going to make sure that the application is able to run on premises, but also in the cloud? And last very big benefit is that you don't have a vendor lock-in. So you can have multi-cloud strategy with Azure Arc, or with a hybrid scenario. You can leverage not only the Microsoft Azure platform, but also third-party platforms. And that's where, like I said, Azure Arc comes into play. So it's the gap between the well-known data centers, well-known on-premises environments, and Microsoft Azure or other multi-cloud vendors. And that's where Azure Arc fits in and does a really good job in making the bridge between the on-premises and also the cloud environments. So how does it work? What do you get with Azure Arc? Well, you get a single control plane. You know that you can use the same management tools and experience, for example, the Azure Portal, Cloud Shell, Bash CLI, but also the ecosystem in the marketplace that the Azure customers, so the Azure users right now use and know a lot. Those same tools you can still use for your own premises environment, and bringing that into place. So you can start with your Azure environment and then use the same tools, and then have, for example, your tools that are communicating with the ARM, so with the Azure Resource Manager. And for that, you can use the management services on top, like Azure Monitor, Update Management. You can have Azure Backup, but also leverage Security Center to have a security compliance state across all your environments, not only your Azure environment, but also your hybrid on-premises environment. So you can use RBAC to assign roles to specific users that can manage, for example, servers or Kubernetes clusters and so on. You can have an inventory not only of your cloud environment, but also of your hybrid environment. And then you can still use your automation that you know right now, your automation that communicates with the ARM. So with the resource manager, you can build templates not only to deploy resources in Azure, but also to activate different management services on your on-premises environment. And Azure Arc is sitting between the resource manager and your own environment. So that can be in any location, and you can have different flavors of Azure Arc, which I will explain a little bit later. But you can onboard servers, you can onboard Kubernetes clusters, and you can also onboard SQL Server. And for that, you have the tools that you know. For example, to manage your SQL Server, you can use Azure Data Studio. You have the Kubernetes native tools to manage your Kubernetes cluster, but now you can also use Windows Admin Center to manage those VMs and to manage those workloads for you. So like I said, Azure Arc gives you a single control plane. That means that you have one view of your Arc-enabled infrastructure and also your Arc-enabled services. So those are two very important flavors of Azure Arc and benefits that you get when using Azure Arc. So you can onboard your infrastructure, you can Arc-enable your infrastructure, and that can be servers, so VMs, or even Kubernetes clusters, if you will. And then you have the Arc-enabled services, and beneath that you have the data services, but also other services, like you can run Azure Functions in your on-premises data center, so you can leverage the serviceless technology in your own hybrid environment or multi-cloud environment, if you will. So Azure Arc is sitting on top of your own data center, your edge location, or your multi-cloud environment. And if you look at what is the Azure Arc enabled infrastructure, So we, like I said, we have three flavors. Azure Arc enabled servers can be for Windows servers, but also for Linux servers in different flavors. And then you have the Azure Arc enabled SQL Server, which will give you the opportunity to not only organize, but also do an inventory, do monitoring, do governance, security, but also, for example, you can do the SQL assessment, if you will, on your local on-premises SQL server and then get those results into your Azure environment. And the third Azure Arc enabled infrastructure is Kubernetes. So you can onboard a Kubernetes cluster. They're the same things. You can apply Azure policies to it. You can onboard it into Azure Security Center. You can have an Azure inventory. And mainly you can also monitor the complete clusters, so your nodes, pods, and so on, you can all see in Azure Monitor. And the opportunity that you have when you onboard a Kubernetes cluster is that you can use the GitOps approach. So with that, we mean that you can have a configuration in place that is the desired state. And that desired state is going to be applied on your Kubernetes cluster. So you can deploy a configuration, you can deploy an application, if you will, on your Kubernetes clusters that is sitting on premises or in another cloud, if you will, on any platform. As long as it's CNCF certified, then it will work with the Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. So what are the use cases? Well, the use cases for Azure Arc are very simple. With Azure Arc, you can organize and also govern across all your environments. So not only the things that you do in your Azure cloud environment, but also in on-premises environment. You have the Kubernetes applications at scale, so you can manage those. You can use the GitOps approach to apply your application configuration to your on-premises clusters, and you can run data services everywhere. So that's the next thing I will talk about. But first of all, let's have a look how the Azure Arc enabled servers look like. So Azure Arc enabled servers, like I said, can be Windows OS, but also Linux OS. With there, you have your VM or even a bare metal server that you can onboard into an Azure Arc enabled service that you can see then in the Azure portal. And with that, you can, like I said, organize, but also do an inventory at scale for your workloads that are spread in your complete environment. And if those resources, those servers are onboarded, then you can apply governance, but also security. So you have built-in Azure policies that you can apply. You have the security best practices, the security baseline that you can set not only for your cloud environment, but also for your on-premises hybrid environment. And then you have the role-based operations that you can use the same role-based access control methodology and groups that you use right now to apply on your on-premises environment. So the operation model is the same, and that's how we look at it. We see that you have to start from within the cloud and then manage your hybrid environment the same way as you do in your cloud environment. So Azure Arc enabled servers, what's the benefit of it, using it with Azure Arc? Well, you have the additional services that you don't have in an on-premises environment, like, for example, Azure Policy. You can deploy Azure Defender on it. You can use Azure Sentinel to get all the logs from a log analytics workspace that put that in Azure Sentinel and do your magic in there and see what is happening on not only on your cloud environment, but also on your Azure environment. You can use Azure Monitor, but also the change and inventory tracking is very interesting, that you see what is happening on your environment or what has happened on your environment. And you can onboard those servers in update management. So you can have the same policies that you use for your update management, that can you also apply on your hybrid workloads. And like I said, Security Center, very big topic nowadays. You can onboard those servers also in Security Center. You can apply Azure Defender, if you will, via policies, or you can do it manually, but it can also also be on your hybrid workloads. A new thing, still in preview, but you can use private link to securely connect networks to Azure Arc. So that means that you can have your on-premises network via an VPN or express route to an Azure network, and in that way you can private link or private link enable the service, so you can have your extensions, Azure policy, guest configuration, for example, that is going via the Azure Arc service to your private link that is connected with your on-premises environment. So you don't have to expose any public service there. It's just going via the private link service. So that's a very neat and new preview feature. So you can test it out, but don't use it in production yet. The other thing, not only just servers, but also SQL servers you can enable and onboard in Azure Arc. So that means that you have your data management and that benefit from that data management, but also the flexibility to have your own workloads, your own bare metal servers that are on premises or in a multi-cloud environment that you can onboard. So there is no migration needed. You can just do the management that you know for a SQL server, do it with, for example, Azure policies. You can deploy Azure Defender on it. You can do Azure SQL assessments, if you will, and then see the results in a nice dashboard in your Azure environment. And then this is just a quick screenshot of how it looks if you have an Azure SQL Server enabled through Azure Arc. You will see this in your Azure portal, and then you also see the assessment. So this is how the dashboard looks like if you are doing a SQL assessment and the results are getting back in your Azure environment. So let me just drink a little bit. So the next slide is an overview of what we can do with a Kubernetes environment. So like I said, the key benefits here for onboarding a Kubernetes environment is that you have the Azure management plane. So you have the Azure Resource Manager, Azure Policy. You can use Azure Policy, Azure Portal, but also the known APIs or the CLI, if you will. And then you can have the complete inventory of all your Kubernetes clusters across all the world that are sitting in your own data centers or are hosted in Azure or another cloud vendor. You can have one management plane to rule them all. So you can use a GitOps based approach for deploying configuration as code to one or many clusters, if you will, and also your application deployment will be updated via one single management plane. So you have one source of control, and then you can build in safe deployments. You can build in guardrails for your application development, for your application deployment, but also the configuration. So what is Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes, and what is the benefit of it? Well, like I said, you can connect multiple flavors. It can be any CNCF certified Kubernetes cluster, so that can be in any cloud vendor that you will. It doesn't have to be AKS, the hosted Azure Kubernetes servers, but it can be in any cloud. So that's a very neat thing here. So you know the deployment to all your clusters will be the same way because you have one management plane. You have one configuration that's done via GitOps, so the workflow will be the same if it's a Kubernetes cluster on premises or in any other cloud environment. The operation and monitoring will be the same. Governance and security will also be the same. So you can use the built-in Azure policies. You can use the cluster security baseline, but also the role-based access control that you know right now in your cloud environment. So next thing is Azure Data Services. So for that, we know a lot of things. We have different flavors in Azure. So we have the SQL Server, it's a single instance or an elastic pool. And you also have, if you want the whole shebang, you have the Azure SQL Managed Instance. And that's the one that is now available to host on your on-premises environment. So that's really a big thing. You can have the Azure Arc enabled data services. Right now it's the Azure SQL Managed Instance, but also Azure database for PostgreSQL, so the hyperscale database, you can have that in a connected but also a disconnected support scenario, where you can host an Azure SQL managed instance on your own environment. So that's very neat, and with that you get an always current environment. So you always have the latest updates. It's what they say in evergreen SQL. So you have always the latest version, the latest patched version. It's going to via the control plane that is applying updates on your SQL. So you can leverage the hyperscale possibilities that you know in a cloud environment that you can build in your own and on-premises environment. And how do you do that? Well, the underlying infrastructure is still Kubernetes, so it's leveraging the Kubernetes technology to make that hyperscale available, and the deployment that you do, but also the scaling and also automatic update will be done via the Kubernetes environment. So that's why you have the elastic scale. Deployment will be in seconds, scale up, scale out. Automation of scaling can be in place because the Kubernetes environment is managing that. So you have a unified management platform. If you're running SQL managed instance in Azure or on-premises environment, it will be the same. You can use Azure Data Studio to connect to it, but just let me explain how the data services architecture looks like. So here in this diagram, you will see that the underlying layer is any Kubernetes cluster. So you can have, again, any CNCF certified Kubernetes cluster. And on top of that, you can host your Azure Arc data controller. So it's the Azure Arc data controller that is communicating via the Azure Data CLI with the Kubernetes API that is then talking to the whole infrastructure. But it's a data controller that has the integration with Kubernetes, but also the integration with Azure Arc. So later on in a demo, I will show what is happening if you deploy the Azure Data Controller. But when you have the data controller, then it will have the APIs. It will have the Azure Arc integration, but also it will be able to patch and update your infrastructure. It will be responsible for scaling, backup, DR scenarios, but also provisioning your applications and do monitoring and get the logs of your environment. And on top of that, you can host your SQL managed instance or your PostgreSQL hyperscale database. And in the future, there will be other data services available, but also analytics engine. So the Azure Arc enabled data services are very interesting if you have a data architecture that you need to host on premises, but you want to leverage all the good things that you know in Azure environment. For example, again, the identity, having the resource inventory, doing the logs, telemetry, backup, and so on. The consumption will all be available for you if you run the Azure Arc enabled data services. So let me now show you quickly a demo of the environment that we have right now. Maybe I will start not only with the Kubernetes environment, but also with the Azure Arc enabled servers. So one thing I have to note here is that I am using the Azure Arc Jumpstart Arcbox. So that if you don't know the Jumpstart, go look for it. It's a very neat platform. It's based on different ARM templates, different scripts that you can use to just test out Azure Arc, but also implement Azure Arc. So there are a lot of scenarios on that website that is Microsoft providing to you, so you can have an Azure Arc environment that you build on your own, and that you that you can test out. So how does it look like if we have just a look at the environment? Let me switch screens here. I will go to my Azure environment, and if you search for Azure Arc, then you will see that you have the different flavors here. You have the infrastructure where you can onboard your servers, not only servers, but also Kubernetes clusters and your SQL Server. So how it looks like if we onboard a server? Well, then you will be asked, will you add one server, single server, or will you add multiple servers? Will you add them to Azure Update Management? If you add, for example, one single server, then you will need to have a script, a PowerShell or a Bash script that you need to run on your on-premises environment. So let me choose here for example, a Windows operating system. It has a public endpoint. You see that the private endpoint here is in preview. So you can have a connectivity method that is a private endpoint. You can add, for example, my data center is in Ghent, for example, Belgium, and so on. You can apply tags if you will. And then the last step is just to download the script and run the PowerShell script on your VM. So what it will do is that it will allow you to run that script and then onboard the servers to Azure Arc. So that's the thing for Azure Arc. The next thing is the Kubernetes cluster. In that way, it's also the same. If you want to onboard a Kubernetes cluster, then the same thing will happen. So you have to choose your subscription, choose your resource group, and then, for example, give it a cluster name, cluster back to school, for example. You can again apply the tags if you will, and then you need to run the script. So the script, and here you see that this command, so it's an extension of the Azure CLI, and it's the connected Kubernetes command that will connect the cluster to a specific resource group in your Azure environment. When you do that, so you need to copy that script, go to your Kubernetes cluster, run that, log into the Azure portal, so you authenticate against your own subscription or your own tenant, and then it will get onboarded into your Azure environment. If we, for example, go back to Azure Arc and we have a look at our already onboarded servers, so I have 3 VMs that are onboarded. I have a Windows VM, Linux VM, and also a SQL Server. If I have a look at the Windows VM, you will see that you have different things that you can do. So the capabilities here are use update management, go for the log analytics enabling so that the logs of your VM will be sent to a log analytics workspace, and in that way you have the monitoring insights. You can apply policies, you can do change tracking and inventory, and you can onboard it into Security Center. So let's have a look and let's see which extensions are installed. So it's the extensions that are used to communicate from your on-premises VM with the Azure environment. So first of all, the Microsoft Monitoring Agent, so the Log Analytics Agent, is used to collect all the logs, and if you onboard it to Update Management, you also have the Dependency Agent for Windows. So if you look at Update Management, then you will see that the servers are onboarded, and for example, you can see that the on-premises VM has some very important security update that I still need to install, and also other cumulative updates, and also a Microsoft Defender antivirus. So the definition updates are also in this list. So you can onboard it, you can have your own schedule for deployment of the updates. You can set all the things that you know for update management, but use it for your on-premises VMs. And not only for your Windows VMs, but also for your Linux VMs. And then you have inventory and also change tracking. So if you have specific software installed, you will see it here. It will read out the Windows registry services. You can see change tracking if you will also. So here change tracking will get all the details about the things that have changed in the last 24 hours or later. And then very nice is the insights dashboard, where you can see all the things that are happening on your VM, so on your on-premises networks, and you can have all those things in place. A good thing that you also can use, if I go back to, for example, my resource group, is that you can, for example, you can make a workbook, an Azure Monitor workbook, and in that workbook you can specify a lot of things. So you can not only monitor your servers, but also your Kubernetes clusters, and then you can do, for example, an inventory of your environment, but also the monitoring here is very interesting, where you can see, for example, the CPU utilization or the memory on specific VM. So this is my Linux VM. If you go to the Windows VM, you will see the same thing. You can change the time range, if you will. And it's not only for your Windows VMs, but also for your Kubernetes clusters. So you have to specify your log analytics workspace because the data is being sent to that workspace. And as you can see, it's very calm on my Kubernetes cluster. But you see that you can read all the pod status and the pod count and so on. You can do a lot of things. Also security. So if you onboard it in Security Center and you send the logs from Security Center also to a log analytics workspace, then here you will get the recommendation. So that's not by default. The thing that you have to do is that you need to export those logs to a log analytics workspace. So let me show you that. If you go to your Security Center, let me go to Security Center here, and then you go to pricing and settings, and then you select your subscription. You see that I have Azure Defender on. Always enable Azure Defender. It's a best practice. It will keep your environment safe. Then for getting the logs into Azure Monitor, you need to enable the continuous export and then specify your log analytics workspace. So for that, if you've done that, you will see that all the recommendations will also be available, for example, in Azure Monitor or in your Azure Monitor workbook. The next thing I wanted to show you, so I have two Kubernetes clusters onboarded. The one is for just showing the plain Kubernetes things, and the other one is for the data services. So we need a Kubernetes cluster to host the data services. Let me switch to my Arc box here. So you will see that I have the two clusters. So I'm on the right cluster. If we see, for example, the Helm deployments, let me just change this and see if my keyboard is okay. So if you do a Helm list, you see that the Azure Arc has been deployed, and that's the one that is that is doing all the magic in the background. So it's installing a lot of things on your cluster to have all your Azure Arc operations, but also the proxy, for example, identity certificate, all those things will be deployed. These are secrets, these are the deployments that has been done. But you can see that not only the plain vanilla Kubernetes will be onboarded, it will also have a lot of other things in place that you can use. For example, if I go back to my cluster to, for example, see the insights. So you can do it with an Azure Monitor workbook, but you also can do it with via your insights dashboard that's in preview, but very neat for your Kubernetes environment. And this is an on-premises Kubernetes cluster. So you can have the same cluster information, node information, controller information, container information, as you know in your Azure environment. So very neat here to do some troubleshooting, to do monitoring, and so on. The other thing I have explained in the slide decks is the GitOps approach. So with the GitOps workflow, you can have any get enabled repository where your application or your configuration is, and then you can apply it to your Kubernetes cluster, even if it's on an on-premises environment. So let me look here in my repository. So I have a simple repository. I forked that from the Azure environment and a simple Azure Kubernetes demo. And here you can see that we just have simple manifests that will deploy an application that will deploy different namespaces and will also so that's the application. I will also do the configuration for you. So if you have a look in the portal, the thing is that once you change something in your Git repo and you follow the GitOps approach, so that means that you do a pull request, the pull request needs to be approved, then the cluster will look at changes in the Git repo, and then you will see that, for example, if we change something here in the application will be deployed to your Kubernetes environment. Let me show what you can see here. If we search for all the namespaces, you will see that we have an Azure Arc namespace, and that Flux agent is being installed and is also used, so that there is a Flux agent that will look at the Git repo and then push those different configuration or application changes to your cluster. So it's one approach that you know from your on-premises environment that you can do on your so the things that you know from your cloud environment you can also use in the on-premises environment. One thing I didn't show you are the Azure policies, so you can apply the same policies that you know, the Arc enabled policies, to your on-premises Kubernetes. The next thing I want to show is the demo of the data services. So let me show you how we create a data service. So if you go to the marketplace, and in the marketplace you search for the SQL managed instance, then you will see that you have different flavors. So you can have the known Azure SQL managed instance, but there is also a SQL managed instance that is specific for Azure Arc. And when you create that, you will see that you need to select a subscription. Of course, you give the instance a name, and then you will see that the very important thing here is the custom location, and the custom location is your on-premises location. So Azure Arc Data Services enables a custom location on your Kubernetes cluster that is controlled via the data controller. So the data controller is your component that will look at your cluster and your Azure environment. So that's the bridge between, and will communicate with that custom location. So if we choose here and we select all the things, we fill in all the things, we do deployment, then this Azure SQL Managed Instance will be deployed on my on-premises environment. That is my Kubernetes cluster. So let me show you what namespaces and so on that you have on your Kubernetes cluster. Let's see if I can just change the context here. So I will change context to my other cluster so I can see if I can copy, otherwise I need to type it very quickly. So what namespaces and services, pods, replica sets, and all the other things that we have here in our Arc namespace. So you see that we have a SQL Server, that we have different pods running for the logs, also the metrics that will control all those things. We have different services that are exposed that you can use to connect with your tools. So not only the known CLI tools you can use, but very interesting is that now you have the Azure Data Studio that you can connect to your SQL managed instance, but also your other hyperscale databases, if you will. You will see that we have just a demo database here, and we can run on that database a simple query. And you see that that simple query will give us the version, and the version will always be the latest one. So that's very short how all those things work. So you just make a connection via Azure Data Studio to your SQL managed instance endpoint, and then you can do all your SQL magic via the Azure Data Studio. And one thing you also get for free is the Grafana. So Grafana is your graphical monitoring system and interface that you will see for your SQL environment. So you know the transaction history, you can see the batch that are happening, you can see the wait statistics and so on, the memory that is being used, database activity. So that is also implemented in the SQL managed instance on your on-premises environment. So that's very cool to see that all those things are coming as one service, as one package into your environment. If we have a look at the pricing then for closing, so what can we see and what do we know about the pricing? Well, you have, of course, there is no additional cost to use Azure Arc, but you have the cost for using the additional services like Azure Monitor. If you are going to put all your logs in a log analytics workspace, then it's going to cost you money. If you use Security Center, if you enable Azure Defender on, that you have to pay for Azure Defender on services, even if it's on your on-premises environment. So that has nothing to do with Azure Arc. Those are just the services that you know and use right now in your cloud environment. That will also cost you money. So what will cost you money in Azure Arc then? Well, if you have the Azure Control Plane functionality, that's for free. The Kubernetes configuration for your Azure resources for free, but for Arc resource, for the first 6 vCPUs are free, but then you are paying $2 per vCPU per month from there on. And then for the other things, the license that is included, the pay-as-you-go price will be $153. But if you use the Azure Hybrid benefit, you know that you also get benefit from that, and you will have reduced costs. So you then only pay $80 for that per month. So that was it. I want to thank you all for watching. I definitely want to thank Dwayne for organizing again this very cool event, and I hope to see you all next year again. See you. Bye.